History remembers what was written down, but it forgets what was hidden behind walls. In the year 1853, inside a respectable house that looked no different from any other, a secret lived and breathed in the dark. By day, she was a woman of order, silence, and strict control. By night, she carried a candle through narrow halls to a place no one else was allowed to know existed. Behind those walls was a man the world believed gone forever, locked away not out of cruelty, but out of fear, love, and a choice that would slowly destroy them both. This is not a story of simple good or evil. This is the story of a woman who hid a man from history and only visited him after midnight. Before we go any further into this story, take a moment to subscribe to History Unmasked, hit the bell icon, and stay with us until the very end. Because what begins as a quiet secret behind ordinary walls will slowly unravel into a truth that refuses to stay hidden, and you won't want to miss how it ends. In the year 1853, on a street that looked no different from any other, stood a house that never truly slept. Though to outsiders it appeared calm, respectable, and obedient to the rhythm of the town. Its shutters opened at dawn and closed at dusk, its lamps extinguished at a proper hour, its doors locked with reassuring finality, and the woman who lived there was known for her discipline, her restraint, and her silence, a woman whose presence inspired trust precisely because she never explained herself and never invited questions. Yet from the moment she acquired the house, she began altering it in ways no one noticed at first. Small renovations justified as maintenance. Walls thickened slightly, corridors narrowed, a storage room removed from the gave the candle and the key she kept hidden against her body, and moved through the darkened halls with practiced steps, her face composed, her breath controlled, as though she were not walking toward a man locked behind a wall, but toward a duty she had assigned herself and could no longer abandon. The hidden door opened soundlessly, revealing the narrow chamber beyond, and there he stood, or sat, or waited, already awake, already listening, already measuring the passage of time by the distance between her visits. And though neither of them spoke at first, the silence between them was never empty, filled instead with all the questions that could not yet be asked, and all the answers that would come too late. She would stay only as long as she believed necessary, never until dawn, never long enough to risk discovery or comfort. And when she left, locking the door once more, the sound followed her back into the visible house, trailing behind her like a whisper she could not quite escape. And as days passed and then weeks, the world beyond the walls continued as though nothing had changed. Neighbors greeted her politely. Visitors remarked on the order of her home, and no one noticed the way her eyes lingered too long on walls that concealed more than brick and plaster, or the way she flinched at unexpected sounds, or how midnight had become the only hour that truly belonged to her, the hour when the house revealed its secret and demanded her return. When the hidden door closed behind her on that first night, and the lock settled into place with a muted certainty, the man inside understood, with a clarity that startled him, that his life had not ended, but had been folded inward, compressed into a space measured not by distance, but by endurance. And as the days began to pass, he learned quickly that the room was designed less for comfort than for concealment. Its walls thick enough to swallow sound, its ceiling low enough to make every movement deliberate, its air perpetually cool and faintly stale, as though it had never expected to be breathed by someone who intended to stay. And yet he adapted, because adaptation had always been his skill, the quiet ability to survive by noticing what others overlooked, by shrinking his presence until it passed unnoticed. And so he learned the room's moods, how the stone retained cold at night and released it grudgingly by day, how footsteps above him traveled through beams and became echoes he could count, how the house itself seemed to inhale at dusk and exhale just before midnight, signaling her approach long before the latch moved. At first, he believed what she had told him, because belief was easier than imagining betrayal, and because the danger she described was not imagined but real, a shifting web of rumors and interests and consequences that could tighten without warning. And he trusted her judgment because she had always been careful, always controlled, the kind of person who did not act without calculation, and so he told himself that this invisibility was a shield, that being unseen was a form of survival, and he filled the long hours with the few books she brought, reading them slowly, savoring sentences as markers of time, committing passages to memory in case the pages were taken away, and when boredom pressed too hard, he listened to the house, to the muffled sounds of life continuing above him, chairs scraping, doors opening and closing, distant voices that never came close enough to distinguish, and these sounds became proof that the world still existed, that he was not yet erased. Her visits followed a pattern so precise it bordered on ritual, always after midnight, always with a candle whose flame bent slightly as she entered, illuminating her face in fragments rather than whole, and she spoke in measured tones, careful not to linger on anything that might invite argument or despair, updating him on the outside world with facts stripped of interpretation, telling him what he needed to. No, but never what he wanted to hear, and when he asked how long this would last, she answered with phrases instead of promises, saying only that time was necessary, that patience would be rewarded, and that trust was essential, and because he had little else to offer, he gave her that trust, believing that silence now would lead to freedom later. But as weeks slid into months, the shape of his waiting began to change, the hope that had once sharpened his attention dulling into something heavier and more static, because waiting without an endpoint is not patience but suspension, and suspension slowly alters the mind, stretching moments until they lose proportion, making small disappointments feel vast and distant possibilities feel unreal. And he began to notice how his thoughts circled rather than moved forward, how memories repeated themselves with minor variations, how his own voice sounded unfamiliar in the enclosed space, softer, less certain, as though the room were absorbing not just sound, but conviction. He watched her carefully during her visits, noticing changes she likely believed invisible, the way her gaze lingered on the walls as if measuring them, the way her responses grew shorter when he pressed for details, the way she avoided certain questions by shifting the candle or adjusting her grip on the key, and slowly, reluctantly, he began to understand that whatever danger existed outside, something else was growing inside her, a reliance on control that extended beyond protection and into ownership of the situation itself. He did not accuse her. Not at first, because accusation requires confidence, and he was learning how fragile confidence becomes when every choice is mediated by someone else's permission, and instead he tried to remind her of who he had been before the walls, recounting shared memories, shared understandings, moments when decisions had been mutual rather than imposed, but each attempt seemed to exhaust her, and she would listen with an expression that suggested sympathy rather than recognition, as though she were indulging a story rather than recalling a truth. The room, meanwhile, continued its quiet work, shaping his days into sameness, pressing him into routines he did not consciously choose but gradually obeyed, waking and sleeping by sounds rather than light, eating because the food arrived rather than because hunger announced itself, speaking only when she was present, and when she was gone, rehearsing conversations that might never happen. And there were moments, fleeting and frightening, when he realized that if the door were to open unexpectedly, he might hesitate before stepping through, not out of loyalty or fear, but because the world beyond had begun to feel abstract, a place described rather than experienced. This realization unsettled him deeply, and it was then that his questions began to change, shifting from when he would leave to whether he was still allowed to imagine leaving at all. And though he did not yet voice these thoughts, they colored every interaction, every silence, every careful word exchanged beneath the candlelight. And as the house above continued to function flawlessly, presenting an image of order and normalcy to anyone who crossed its threshold, the hidden room beneath it grew heavier with unspoken tension, because the man inside was slowly becoming someone the world could forget, and the woman who visited him each night was slowly becoming someone who might prefer it that way. By the time he began to sense that the room was changing him in ways he could not fully measure, midnight had already become more than an hour. It had become a boundary, a fragile crossing point where two versions of reality briefly touched, and the man waited for it with an attention that bordered on devotion, counting the subtle signals that announced her approach long before she appeared. the soft creak of a floorboard settling above, the faint disturbance in the air that suggest movement in the corridor, the almost imperceptible pause in the house's quiet, as if even the walls were holding their breath. And when the latch finally moved and the door opened, the candlelight spilled into the room like something alive, stretching shadows across the stone and briefly restoring dimension to a space that otherwise flattened everything within it. She always entered the same way, carefully, deliberately, closing the door behind her before turning fully toward him, as though she needed the barrier in place to steady herself, and for a few moments they existed in a silence that felt thicker than before, no longer tentative but weighted with recognition, because by now both understood that these nightly meetings were no longer simply acts of reassurance or duty, but the only moments in which they were allowed to acknowledge one another as fully human. During the day she was composed, efficient, unremarkable, a woman whose control was so complete it appeared natural, but here, in the narrow chamber after midnight, small fractures appeared, visible only in the way she loosened her posture, in how her eyes softened when she met his, in the way she sometimes lingered on his presence, as if memorizing it against a future she could not name. Their conversations grew longer and more complex, moving beyond practical matters into shared reflections that neither had planned to voice. And though she often steered them away from dangerous territory, there were nights when she allowed the discussion to drift, when the candle burned low and the shadows pressed close and she forgot, briefly, the rules she had constructed around herself. He spoke of time then, not asking when he would leave but describing how it behaved inside the room, how days felt stretched thin, how memories lost their edges, how hope became something that needed deliberate effort to maintain. And she listened, truly listened, her expression tightening, not with irritation, but with something like guilt, because she could not deny the truth of what he described, yet she also could not imagine dismantling the structure she had built, not without unraveling herself along with it. Midnight gave them permission to speak honestly, but it also limited that honesty, because every truth spoken was constrained by the knowledge that it could not be acted upon, and this contradiction created a tension that vibrated beneath every word, making even simple exchanges feel charged with meaning. There were nights when he laughed softly at something she said, and the sound startled them both, so unused were they to joy in that space, and there were nights when she reached out unconsciously, stopping herself just short of contact, as though remembering too late that touch might make the illusion of control impossible to maintain. He began to notice that she measured time differently now as well, glancing toward the candle more frequently, stiffening when it burned too low, as though she feared that if she stayed too long the world outside might notice the absence she created, and this awareness sharpened his understanding of her fear, not fear of discovery alone, but fear of what she allowed herself to feel in these moments, fear that the person she became after midnight was not the one she believed herself to be. As weeks passed, the hour itself seemed to contract, growing shorter, more fragile, and he began to sense her internal struggle even when she did not speak of it, the way she would arrive already tense, the way her answers sometimes felt rehearsed, as though she had practiced restraint before unlocking the door, and this change unsettled him more than the confinement ever had, because it suggested that midnight was no longer a refuge for her but a risk she was beginning to resent. One night, driven by a need he could no longer suppress, he asked her directly whether she still believed this was temporary, and the question hung between them, illuminated harshly by the candle. Illite, and though she did not immediately answer, her silence spoke volumes, stretching longer than any pause before, until she finally said that some things, once hidden, could never safely return to the light, and in that moment he understood that her definition of safety had expanded to include herself, her reputation, her carefully ordered existence, and that his continued invisibility served more than one purpose. The realization did not come with anger, but with a profound sadness, because he could see how deeply she had bound herself to the secret, how her identity had become entangled with the act of keeping him hidden, and how midnight, once a shared space of fragile connection, was slowly becoming a negotiation between obligation and avoidance. From that night on, their conversations carried an undercurrent of finality neither was ready to acknowledge. And though the ritual continued, The candle, the door, the careful words, the hour felt increasingly borrowed, as though it might be taken away at any moment, leaving behind only the memory of voices that had dared to speak when the world was asleep. As the fragile balance of midnight began to strain under the weight of unspoken truths, the days outside the hidden room grew heavier for her, not because anything had visibly changed, but because everything inside her had, and control, once a tool she wielded effortlessly, began to feel like a structure she had to constantly reinforce lest it collapse around her. So she tightened her routines, rose earlier, slept less, measured her words with greater care, and corrected small imperfections in the house with an urgency that bordered on obsession, as though order in visible spaces might compensate for the disorder growing behind the walls. The man noticed the change immediately during her visits, sensing how her posture had stiffened, how her eyes no longer lingered on his face, but darted instead to the corners of the room, the candle, the door, and he understood that something fundamental had shifted, that midnight was no longer simply a shared refuge, but a responsibility she was beginning to resent, and yet she continued to come, driven by a compulsion she did not name, unlocking the door night after night as if obeying a rule written somewhere deeper than reason. Their conversations grew uneven, marked by long stretches of silence, punctuated by moments of sudden intensity, and when he spoke of his inner world, of the way his thoughts looped, of the strange comfort and terror predictability, of how the room had begun to feel less like a prison and more like a definition, she responded with sharp reassurances that sounded increasingly hollow, insisting that she was doing what had to be done, that sacrifice was unavoidable, that some lives required difficult choices, and he listened, recognizing in her words the language of justification rather than conviction. He began to understand that her control over his confinement had become inseparable from her control over herself, that releasing him would not simply expose a secret, but dismantle the narrative she had constructed to survive her own decision, and this realization weighed on him more heavily than the walls ever had, because it meant that his freedom was now tied not to circumstance, but to her willingness to confront the truth of what she had become. As weeks turned into months, the room continued its quiet transformation of him, not through cruelty, but through constancy, shaping his expectations, dulling his urgency, teaching him to accept small mercies as significant victories, and this frightened him deeply, because he could feel his resistance softening, his imagination narrowing, and he worried that even if she opened the door one night and told him to leave, he might hesitate, might need time to remember how to live without permission. This fear sharpened his words when he finally voiced it, telling her that he felt himself changing, that he was becoming someone what existed only in relation to her visits, and though he spoke without accusation, his honesty struck her like a blow, forcing her to confront the unintended consequences of her control, and for a brief moment, something like panic crossed her face, a crack in the composed exterior she worked so hard to maintain. She reacted by asserting boundaries more firmly, shortening her visits, steering conversations back to neutral ground, reminding him, sometimes sharply, of the danger that still existed outside, and this tightening of control created a distance that had not been there before, turning midnight from a moment of shared vulnerability into a carefully managed interaction, governed by unspoken rules. The house seemed to reflect this shift, its quiet no longer soothing but oppressive, its walls feeling less like shelter and more like witnesses, and she found herself listening constantly for sounds that might signal discovery, flinching at knocks on the door, questioning servants and visitors with an intensity that drew subtle attention, and all the while the hidden room remained unchanged, its silence absorbing the tension she carried with her each night. He began to test the limits of her control in small ways, asking questions she could not easily deflect, lingering on topics she preferred to avoid, not out of spite, but out of a desperate need to reassert his agency. And these moments often ended with her retreating behind formality, extinguishing the candle sooner than usual, locking the door with a finality that echoed long after her footsteps faded. The imbalance between them grew more pronounced, her authority solidifying even as her certainty eroded, his dependence deepening even as his resentment sharpened. and both sensed that the arrangement they had built could not sustain itself indefinitely, that something would have to give, whether through choice or circumstance. She began to dream of walls closing in, of doors without keys, of rooms that rearranged themselves while she slept, and she woke each morning with a lingering sense of unease that followed her through the day, a constant reminder that control, once absolute, had become fragile, requiring constant vigilance to maintain. He, meanwhile, dreamed of open spaces he could not quite enter, of standing at thresholds uncertain which side he belonged to, and these dreams left him with a quiet urgency that colored his words, pushing him toward a confrontation neither of them was ready for. By the end of that season, midnight no longer felt like an hour they shared, but like a test they both endured, a measure of how long they could continue pretending that control and care were the same thing, and though neither spoke it aloud, both understood that the weight of control was becoming too heavy to carry without consequence, that the walls which had once promised safety were now demanding a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. By the time the weight of control had settled fully into their shared awareness, the relationship between them had slipped into a strange and nameless territory that neither love nor cruelty could accurately describe, a space defined instead by proximity without presence and care without freedom, and it was within this quiet contradiction that something intimate yet profoundly isolating took root, because whatever existed between them was witnessed by no one else, recorded nowhere, and shaped entirely by the limits of secrecy itself. Their nights together began to feel suspended from the world, untethered from consequence in a way that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. And as the months continued to layer upon one another, they developed a language made not of declarations but of glances, pauses, and the careful selection of what to say and what to leave unsaid. He came to recognize the subtle differences in her footsteps as she approached, could tell from the cadence of her breathing whether she had arrived burdened or resolved. And she, in turn, learned the precise tone of his voice that signaled when he was merely speaking and when he was quietly unraveling. And these observations created an intimacy that felt earned yet undeserved, because it thrived only in the absence of witnesses, dependent on the very confinement that sustained it. There were nights when she brought small comforts, an extra blanket folded with care, a candle of better quality, a book she thought he might enjoy. And though these gestures were meant to soften the severity of his isolation, they also reinforced the imbalance between them, reminders that even kindness flowed in a single direction, granted rather than shared, and he accepted them with gratitude that felt increasingly complicated, aware that each gift carried an unspoken price, binding him more closely to the rhythm of her visits. Conversation during these nights drifted into memories more often than plans, because imagining a future had become too dangerous, too heavy with disappointment, and instead they lingered in recollections of who they had been before the walls, speaking of moments that felt unreal now, like scenes from a life that belonged to someone else, and in these recollections there was warmth, even tenderness, but also a sharp ache, because remembering together only emphasized the distance between then and now. She found herself lingering longer on these nights, sitting closer, letting the candle burn lower than she intended, and sometimes she spoke with a softness that surprised even her, revealing fragments of doubt she never allowed to surface during the day, admitting, without naming it, that the secret had begun to define her more than any role she played in the visible world. He listened with an attention that bordered on reverence, not because her doubts absolved her, but because they proved she was still capable of seeing him as more than a problem to be managed. And in those moments he allowed himself to imagine that what bound them was not simply circumstance but choice, a mutual recognition that transcended the walls. Yet this imagined equality was fragile, constantly undermined by the reality of the door, the lock, the key that never left her possession, and when she stood to leave, gathering herself back into composure, the illusion collapsed, replaced by the familiar imbalance that defined their existence. There were nights when this transition hurt more than he could contain, and he would watch her carefully as she prepared to go, wondering whether she felt the same sharp division between who she was inside the room and who she became once she stepped beyond it, and though she never said it, her hesitation at the threshold suggested that she did, that the act of leaving required a deliberate severing of something she was no longer certain she could afford to lose. Love, if it could be called that, grew quietly in these moments, not expressed through touch or promise, but through endurance, through the continued return to a space neither of them could justify yet neither could abandon, and this love was complicated by guilt on her part and by dependence on his, creating a bond that felt deeply human and deeply flawed, sustained by secrecy and threatened by exposure. He began to realize that her visits were not simply acts of responsibility, but also acts of preservation, not just of him, but of the part of herself that still believed she was capable of compassion. And this realization softened his resentment even as it sharpened his sorrow, because it meant that his confinement served an emotional function she might not survive losing. The room, meanwhile, remained unchanged, absorbing their voices, holding their silences, bearing witness to a connection that could not be acknowledged anywhere else, and in this contained space, love existed without witness, without validation, and without future. A fragile thing sustained entirely by the fragile agreement that neither would name it aloud. As this unspoken bond deepened, it also became more dangerous, because love that cannot be seen, cannot be corrected, cannot be challenged, and cannot be released, and both of them felt in different ways that they were approaching a point where the secrecy sustaining their connection would either collapse under its own weight or harden into something that would trap them both beyond escape. By the time love without witness had settled into something heavy and unspoken between them, the house itself began to feel less like a neutral container of their secret and more like an active participant, responding to the strain of what it held with subtle signs that neither of them could ignore. And it was then that the first cracks appeared, not in stone or timber, but in the fragile illusion that secrecy alone could sustain them indefinitely. She noticed it first during the day, when the house should have felt safest, in moments that arrived without warning, a floorboard that groaned beneath her step though it never had before, a draft where no window existed, a faint sound at the edge of hearing that vanished when she turned toward it. And these small disturbances unsettled her deeply, because they suggested that the house was no longer as obedient as she believed, that its silence could not be commanded forever. Her vigilance intensified, and with it her exhaustion, as she checked doors repeatedly, paused mid-task to listen for sounds that might betray her, and questioned her own memory of whether she had already done things she could no longer clearly recall. And this erosion of certainty followed her into the night, into the hidden room, where the man sensed immediately that something was wrong long before she spoke of it. Her visits grew tense, marked by sudden silences and abrupt shifts in conversation, and when he asked what troubled her, she deflected with practiced ease, attributing her unease to the ordinary pressures of life beyond the walls, but her eyes betrayed her, scanning the room as though it might change shape if she looked away too long. The man, attuned now to every nuance of her presence, understood that the fear she carried was no longer abstract, but immediate, born of the realization that secrets leave traces even when carefully tended, and this understanding awakened something restless in him, a sense that the stability he had reluctantly accepted was beginning to fracture. He began to notice changes in himself as well, subtle at first, but increasingly difficult to ignore, moments when his thoughts moved too slowly, when he struggled to recall details that once came easily, when he felt a strange detachment from his own emotions, as though the room had begun to smooth his edges, sanding away urgency and anger alike, and this frightened him more than despair ever had, because it suggested not just confinement, but transformation, a quiet reshaping of identity that no rescue could fully reverse. One night, driven by a need that could no longer be postponed, he spoke of this fear aloud, telling her that he felt himself disappearing, not physically, but internally, that the longer he remained unseen, the more unreal he became, even to himself. And his words struck her with unexpected force, because they echoed a fear she had never allowed herself to articulate, that in hiding him from the world she might be erasing him piece by piece. Her response was defensive, sharp in a way that surprised them both, insisting that survival demanded sacrifice, that change was inevitable, that this was the price of safety, And as the words left her mouth, she realized with a jolt of clarity that she had begun to sound like the walls themselves, solid, unmoving, indifferent to what they enclosed. The tension between them thickened after that night, settling into the space like dust that could not be brushed away, and their conversations became fraught, each word weighed for potential consequence, each silence charged with meaning, and though N either wished to escalate the conflict, it grew nonetheless, fueled by the recognition that their needs were no longer aligned. He wanted assurance that his life still belonged to him, that this hidden existence was not permanent, while she wanted reassurance that her control was justified, that the structure she had built was necessary rather than convenient, and these desires collided repeatedly without resolution. The house mirrored this conflict with increasing insistence, offering small reminders that it was not infallible, a servant mentioning an unfamiliar sound at night, a visitor commenting on a draft that should not exist, a tool found out of place near the altered wall, and each incident sent a surge of panic through her, tightening her grip on the secret, even as it threatened to slip from her control. Her visits grew shorter, her patience thinner, and though she continued to bring small comforts, they felt less like gestures of care and more like attempts to quiet her own guilt, and he accepted them with a growing sense of dread, aware that kindness could not compensate for the narrow. Nothing had been discovered outright. The margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. He listened without interrupting, absorbing her words with a calm that surprised even him, because somewhere deep within, he had already accepted that the stability he clung to was an illusion, and that change, however terrifying, was inevitable. When she finished, she waited, perhaps for him to plead, to offer solutions that would preserve the arrangement, but instead he spoke quietly of the fear he carried, not of discovery but of remaining unseen forever, of losing himself entirely to the room, of waking one day to realize that survival had cost him his sense of being alive. And as he spoke, the honesty in his voice stripped away the last defenses she had constructed, forcing her to confront the truth she had avoided for so long, that whatever her intentions had been, the walls had become instruments of harm as much as protection. The conversation that followed unfolded slowly, painfully, each sentence a careful step into territory neither had wanted to explore, as they spoke of responsibility, of choice, of the difference between keeping someone safe and keeping them contained. And though there were moments of tension, moments when voices rose or words faltered, there was also an undercurrent of mutual recognition, a shared understanding that whatever happened next would mark the end of what they had known. At one point, driven by an impulse she could no longer suppress, she admitted that she no longer knew whether she was protecting him from the world or racing outward, ready to confront the world beyond them. What followed that night did not unfold in a single decisive moment, but rather in a slow, almost imperceptible unraveling, the kind that only becomes visible in hindsight, as though the house itself were releasing its grip one careful breath at a time. And in the days that followed, she moved through her routines with a strange calm that unsettled even her, no longer driven by the frantic vigilance that had once defined her days, but guided instead by a quiet resolve born of exhaustion and clarity. Because once a truth has been fully spoken, it can no longer be unspoken, and though the walls still stood and the door remained locked, something essential had already shifted beyond repair. She found herself lingering in rooms she once passed through without thought, tracing the grain of the wood, listening to the way sound traveled through the structure, as if trying to understand how a house could hold so much silence without collapsing under its weight. And at night she slept fitfully, dreaming not of discovery or punishment, but of empty corridors and doors left ajar, spaces that no longer knew what they were meant to contain. When midnight came, she delayed her visit for the first time, not out of fear of being seen, but out of uncertainty, standing in the corridor with the candle unlit, realizing that returning to the hidden room meant acknowledging that nothing between them could return to what it had been. And when she finally did descend, unlocking the door with a steadiness that surprised her, the encounter was different, quieter, stripped of ritual, because neither of them pretended any longer that time alone could solve what they had created. He greeted her with a calm that bordered on detachment, not coldness but acceptance, as though he had already begun to loosen his grip on the fragile arrangement that had defined his existence for so long, and they spoke then not of plans or fears but of understanding, of what it meant to be remembered, of how lives confined to secrecy are often erased not by force but by convenience. And as he spoke, she understood with a painful clarity that whatever happened next, the version of him she had known within those walls would never exist anywhere else. The days outside continued to press in, and the signs she had feared grew more pronounced, not dramatic enough to force immediate action, but persistent enough to deny denial. And with each passing hour she felt the weight of her decision settle into something solid and unavoidable, because to maintain the secret now required an active cruelty she could no longer disguise as protection. When the moment finally came, it did not arrive as a grand gesture or a public revelation, but as a quiet sequence of choices made deliberately and without witness, and whether she unlocked the door to let him step into the world or arranged for his disappearance into another form of obscurity was something the house alone seemed to know, because afterward the hidden room ceased to function as it once had, its presence felt but unoccupied, its silence different, no longer heavy with waiting but hollow in a way that suggested absence rather than concealment. The house returned, outwardly, to its former order, its routines intact, its walls unchanged, and those who passed through it later sensed only a vague unease they could never fully articulate. A feeling that the space remembered something it was never meant to hold, and though no records ever acknowledged the man, and no official account ever questioned the woman's composure, the truth lingered in subtler ways, in the way certain rooms felt colder than others, in the way sound seemed to falter near the altered wall, in the way the house resisted renovation as if guarding the memory of its own complicity. She lived on, marked not by scandal but by restraint, carrying within her the knowledge that some choices, once made, reshape not only lives, but the spaces that contain them, and though she never spoke of what had happened, she understood that silence does not erase truth, it only changes where it resides. And so the story did not end with justice or reunion or punishment, but with remembrance held not by people or documents, but by walls that had borne witness to a secret too heavy to be forgotten, a reminder that history is not only written in ink and law, but embedded in the structures we build to hide what we cannot face. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the weight of what was hidden and what was lost, subscribe to History Unmasked. Hit the bell icon and leave a comment telling us how deeply this story affected you, because the stories history conceals are often the ones that deserve to be remembered the most.